There was a moment in Orthanc when I saw something in Saruman's eyes that shouldn't have been there. Not madness, not anger, not even ambition. Fear. Pure, absolute terror. The kind of fear that comes from seeing something you can't unsee. From learning something you wish you hadn't. From understandings that everything you thought you knew about the world was a comfortable lie. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. Replaced by something else. Something harder. Colder. Like a door slamming shut on whatever he'd just witnessed. That moment, that single flash of naked fear in the eyes of the wisest being in Middle-earth. That's what I think about when I hear people talk about Saruman's betrayal. When they say he was corrupted by pride, by ambition, by a lust for power. Because I was there. I saw what happened. I heard what he said. And I'm telling you, they're all wrong about why he fell. I was a servant in Isengard, not a wizard, not a scholar, not anyone important or powerful or worth remembering. Just someone who brought food and wine to the tower, who lit fires in cold chambers and cleaned rooms after important meetings, and tried very, very hard to stay invisible, while the great and powerful discussed the fate of Middle-earth. For 15 years I served in Orthanc, watching from the shadows as history unfolded around me. And for most of that time, Saruman the White was exactly what everyone said he was. The greatest of the Istari, the wisest of the 5 wizards sent to Middle-earth, the leader of the White Council, a force for good in a world that desperately, urgently needed it. He was brilliant, charismatic, patient in ways that made mere mortals seem like mayflies. When he spoke, even other wizards listened. When he advised, kings obeyed. He'd spent centuries, actual centuries, studying the enemy, learning his tactics, preparing the free peoples for the war everyone knew was coming. If anyone could stand against Sauron, it was Saruman. That's what we all believed. But something happened. Something changed during one specific night that I will never forget. A night when I watched the greatest mind in Middle-earth look into darkness and make a choice that would lead to the deaths of thousands. I'm going to tell you what I witnessed in that tower, what Saruman showed me, what he said in those moments before everything changed, what offer he was given, and why, Gods help me, part of me still understands why he accepted it. Because everyone thinks Saruman's fall was simple. That he wanted power, that he was seduced by promises of dominion and glory, that his pride made him believe he could control forces he should have opposed. They're wrong. What I saw that night was something far more terrible than simple corruption. What I saw was wisdom, real, genuine, centuries-deep wisdom, leading someone to choose darkness, not because he was fooled, but because he believed it was the right choice, the smart choice, the only choice that made sense, given what he knew. By the time I'm done, you'll understand what Saruman saw in the palantír, what vision Sauron showed him, what calculation he made in his ancient, brilliant mind, and why he decided that serving the enemy was more moral than opposing him. And you'll understand why that terrifies me so much more than if he'd simply been evil all along. Because evil is easy to fight. Evil you can recognize. Evil you can stand against without doubt. But what do you do when wisdom itself tells you to surrender? When the smartest choice is the wrong choice, when every logical path leads to darkness, that's what Saruman faced, and that's what broke him. My name is Taran, son of Aldor. I came to Isengard when I was 16 years old, sent by my family in Rohan to serve in the tower as payment for debts I never fully understood. My father had borrowed money from merchants who had connections to Orthanc. and when he couldn't repay, they demanded service instead. 7 years, they said. Serve in the wizard's tower for 7 years, and the debt would be forgiven. That was 31 years ago. I'm 47 now. No longer young. No longer naive about how power works, or what it does to people who possess it. I've seen things in Orthanc that most people couldn't imagine. I've stood in rooms where the fate of nations was decided. I've heard conversations that would terrify kings. But when I first arrived, I was just a scared boy from the Westfold who'd never been more than 20 miles from his family's farm. The tower was magnificent. Terrifying, but magnificent. A spike of black stone rising from the ring of Isengard, like a shard of the world's bones thrust toward the sky. 500 feet tall, perfectly smooth, built by the Númenóreans in ages past, with craft and knowledge that had been lost to the world thousands of years ago. And at its peak, in chambers carved from living rock, centuries before my grandfather's grandfather was born, lived Saruman the White. I'd heard stories about him, of course. Everyone in Rohan had. The wizard who advised King Theoden's grandfather, who fought against the darkness creeping south from Mirkwood and east from Dol Guldur, who spent his days studying in libraries that held texts from the First Age, and his nights watching the stars, searching for signs and portents that might help the free peoples survive what was coming. He was a legend, a figure from songs and stories. Not quite a god, but close enough that the distinction didn't matter to people like me. The first time I actually saw him, really saw him, close enough to touch, I was carrying firewood up one of the endless spiral staircases that wound through Orthanc's interior. My arms were aching, my legs were burning. I'd already climbed 300 steps and had another 200 to go before I reached the chambers where the fires needed tending. He passed me going down. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. White staircase was wide enough for 2 people, but you didn't get in a wizard's way. That was Rule 1. Rule 2 was, don't speak unless spoken to. Rule 3 was don't look directly at them if you could help it. Saruman swept past in white robes that seemed to glow in the dim light. His staff tapped against stone with each step, a rhythm that was somehow both casual and purposeful. His beard was long and perfectly white, his face lined but strong, his eyes. I broke Rule 3. I looked at his eyes. They were grey, storm grey, the color of clouds before lightning, and they were looking through me like I was glass, like I was so far beneath his notice that acknowledging my existence would be a waste of the fraction of a second it would take. Then he was past, gone down the stairs, and I was alone again with my armload of wood and the understanding that to beings like Saruman, I was furniture. Useful, perhaps. Necessary in an abstract way. But not a person. Not really. That was fine. That was expected. I was there to serve, not to be seen. I learned the patterns of the tower quickly. Had to. There were only 12 servants total, a tiny staff for such a massive structure. But Saruman valued privacy over comfort. Most of the tower's hundreds of rooms stood empty and unused. Saruman himself used perhaps a dozen chambers, his sleeping quarters, his study, his library, the high room where he kept his seeing stone, a few others for specific purposes I never fully understood. My job was simple. Bring firewood before dawn, light the fires in the chambers he'd be using that day, deliver meals at specific times, breakfast at 7, lunch at 1, dinner at 8. Collect the dishes an hour later. Tend the fires throughout the day. Make sure fresh candles were always available. replace them when they burned low. Empty chamber pots. Change linens once a week. Simple, repetitive work that let me become invisible. That's the secret of being a good servant. You learn to move through spaces without disrupting them. To be present but unnoticed. To hear everything and remember nothing, at least officially. Saruman kept strange hours. Sometimes he'd work through the night in his study, and I'd find him in the morning still bent over some ancient text, candles burned down to puddles of wax, his eyes red but still sharp. Other times he'd spend 3 days in his bed chambers, sleeping like the dead, emerging only when his body absolutely demanded it. His moods shifted like weather. Some days he'd be animated, almost cheerful, calling down the stairs to ask me questions about Rohan, about the harvest, about ordinary things that seemed to genuinely interest him. Those were good days, days when he seemed more human than legend. Other days he was dark, silent. He'd pass me in hallways without acknowledgement, locked so deep in his own thoughts that I wondered if he even saw the world around him. On those days, you stayed out of his way, did your work quietly and quickly, and left before he remembered you were there. But mostly, he was simply working, always working. The sheer volume of his research was staggering. He had texts in languages I'd never seen, maps of lands I'd never heard of, star charts that covered entire walls. He corresponded with scholars across Middle-earth. I'd carry letters down to the riders, sealed with his mark, addressed to places as far as Gondor and Rivendell, and even, occasionally, the Grey Havens. He was searching for something. I didn't know what. Didn't need to know. That was his business, and servants didn't ask questions about wizard business. Other wizards visited regularly. Gandalf the Grey came most often. Every few months he'd appear at the gates, usually looking travel-worn and slightly disreputable, like a vagrant who'd wandered in from the wild. Which in a way he was. Gandalf didn't care about appearances, didn't care about dignity or prestige. He'd sit in Saruman's study with his feet up on the furniture, smoking his pipe, arguing about strategy and philosophy and what should be done about the growing darkness in the east. They'd debate for hours, sometimes days, mostly civilly, but occasionally with real heat. I'd hear their voices through the walls as I worked. "You're too cautious, Saruman. We should be acting now, not waiting for... And you're too reckless, Gandalf. Rushing into action without understanding the full scope of the problem is how wars are lost before they're begun. We've been studying the problem for 2,000 years. At some point I have to be certain. That point has not yet arrived." Back and forth. The same arguments, slightly different words, over and over across the years I served there. Gandalf wanted to act. Saruman wanted to understand. Gandalf trusted in people, and hope, and the basic decency of the free peoples. Saruman trusted in knowledge, and planning, and making absolutely sure you knew what you were doing before you committed to a course of action. I didn't know enough to judge who was right, but I knew Saruman was in charge. He was the head of the White Council, the leader of the Order. If Gandalf disagreed, well, Gandalf could disagree all he wanted. Saruman would do what he thought was right. Radagast the Brown came less frequently. He was the strangest of the wizards I met, more interested in birds and animals than in politics or strategy. He'd arrive covered in mud, usually with some creature or another riding on his shoulder or nested in his hair. He'd deliver news from the wild, orc movements, spider sightings, darkness spreading in forests, and Saruman would listen with what I always thought was poorly concealed impatience. Yes, Radagast. The woods are troubled. The shadows grow. I'm aware. Is there any specific intelligence you have that's actionable?" And Radagast would blink his watery eyes and say something about how the thrushes were flying wrong, or the squirrels were agitated, and Saruman would dismiss him with barely concealed frustration. I felt bad for Radagast. He was trying to help. It just wasn't the kind of help Saruman valued. Galadriel visited once, just once in all the years I was there. But that one visit, gods, even now, 3 decades later, I remember it with perfect clarity. She arrived at sunset. I was in the courtyard when she came, and I swear the air itself changed when she passed through the gates. Became clearer somehow, sharper, like reality had been slightly out of focus my entire life, and suddenly snapped into proper alignment. She was tall, taller than any woman I'd ever seen, taller than most men, and beautiful in a way that hurt to look at directly. Not because of any specific feature, but because of what she was. There was power in her. Old power. Power that had seen the light of the 2 trees, that had walked in Valinor before the sun and moon were made. Saruman met her at the base of the tower. I watched from a distance as they spoke. Couldn't hear the words, but could see the way Saruman stood differently, more carefully. Like he was aware that for once he was speaking to someone who might actually be his equal, or his superior. They climbed the tower together, stayed in his high chamber for 6 hours. When she left, Saruman looked troubled, more thoughtful than I'd ever seen him. I never learned what they discussed, but I remember thinking that if beings like Galadriel were worried enough to come to Orthanc in person, then whatever was happening in the world was more serious than even the rumors suggested. For the first 10 years I served in Orthanc, that was my life. Routine, predictable. I woke before dawn, did my work, went to bed exhausted. The years blurred together. I got older, got better at my job, learned to read Saruman's moods, to anticipate his needs before he asked. I was content, in a way. It wasn't freedom. I was still serving out my family's debt. But it was stable, safe. The war everyone kept talking about remained distant and abstract. Something that happened in other places, to other people. Then, slowly, things began to change. It started small. Saruman began sending riders out more frequently. Not messengers carrying letters to other wizards or members of the White Council. These were different. Scouts, searchers. They'd leave with specific instructions about where to go and what to look for, and they'd return weeks later with reports that Saruman would read in private, behind locked doors. He became more secretive about his work, where before he'd often think out loud while I tended the fires, using me as a sort of sounding board, talking through problems not because he expected me to answer, but because speaking thoughts aloud sometimes helped clarify them. Now he fell silent whenever I entered a room. Started locking doors that had always been open. Covered texts and maps when I came to deliver meals. Something had shifted in his research. Some new direction he'd taken that he didn't want observed. The arguments with Gandalf grew more frequent, more heated. I could hear them from 3 floors down. "You're obsessed with it, Saruman. This path leads nowhere good. I'm being thorough. There's a difference between obsession and refusing to leave stones unturned. Some stones should stay unturned. Some knowledge is too dangerous to... Nothing is too dangerous to know. Knowledge is neutral. It's what you do with it that matters. And what are you planning to do with it?" Silence. Long enough that I paused in my work, straining to hear. Then Saruman's voice, cold. "Get out of my tower, Gandalf." More silence. "Please, old friend, don't do this. Whatever you're searching for, it's not... Out!" The slam of a door. Footsteps on the stairs, Gandalf descending, faster than usual. I pressed myself against the wall as he passed, and for just a moment his eyes met mine. There was worry in them. Real worry. Not the abstract concern of someone considering distant problems, but the immediate fear of someone who sees catastrophe approaching and doesn't know how to stop it. He opened his mouth like he might say something, then seemed to think better of it. Shook his head. Continued down. I found out later, years later, that they'd been arguing about the ring. The one ring. The weapon Sauron had made and lost. The thing that contained most of his power, that had been missing for thousands of years. Saruman was searching for it, studying everything known about it, trying to find it before Sauron did. At least, that's what Gandalf thought he was doing. What Gandalf hoped he was doing. The truth was more complicated. The changes continued, accelerated. Saruman spent more time in the High Chamber with the palantír, the seeing stone that was one of Orthunk's most precious and dangerous possessions. The stones had been made in the Elder Days, crafted by the elves of old to allow communication across vast distances. There had been 7 once, scattered across Numenor and later Middle-earth. Most were lost now, destroyed or hidden or claimed by enemies. But Orthunk's stone remained, and Saruman used it with increasing frequency. I knew when he was using it, because the door to that chamber would be locked for hours, sometimes days, and when he emerged, he'd look drained. Using the palantír took something from you, cost something. I didn't understand what, but I could see the price in his face. It was during the 15th year of my service that the night happened. The night that changed everything. Saruman had been locked in the High Chamber for 2 full days. Hadn't eaten. Hadn't slept as far as I could tell. I'd left meals outside the door at the usual times, and each time I'd returned hours later to find them untouched, gone cold. This happened sometimes when he was deep in research or scrying. His focus was absolute. The physical world, food, sleep, comfort, became irrelevant. He'd push himself until his body literally couldn't continue, then collapse for a day or 2 before resuming. But this felt different. There was a pressure in the tower, a tension, like the air before a lightning strike. The other servants felt it too. We moved through our duties with unusual quiet, speaking in whispers when we had to speak at all. Something was building. We all felt it. None of us knew what. Around midnight, I heard the door to the High Chamber open, slowly. Not the usual confident sound of Saruman emerging from work. This was hesitant, uncertain. Then footsteps on the stairs. Slow, unsteady, like someone drunk or injured. I was in the kitchens on the lower level, preparing bread dough for the morning. It was mindless work. Soothing. My hands knew the motions without thought. Knead, fold, turn, repeat. Saruman appeared in the doorway. The moment I saw him, I knew something was catastrophically wrong. He looked diminished. That's the only word I have for it. Like something fundamental had been drained out of him. His face was pale, not just tired pale, but bloodless. His hands were shaking. His robes were disheveled, the hem dirty from dragging on the floor. And his eyes. God's. His eyes. They were wide, staring. The eyes of someone who'd seen something that broke them, that shattered some fundamental understanding of how the world worked and left them scrambling to put the pieces back together into a shape that made sense. "Wine," he said. His voice was rough, cracked from disuse or strain. "Bring wine to my study, the good vintage, the Dorwinian from the private stock." That was unusual. Saruman rarely drank, and when he did, it was never the expensive stuff. The Dorwinian had been a gift from some dignitary years ago. I'd never seen the bottle opened. "Yes, my lord," I said quietly. "And?" He paused, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Stay. When you bring it, I need to speak." I almost dropped the bread dough. In 15 years, Saruman had never asked me to stay, never requested my presence for anything other than the immediate performance of some task. To him, I was hands that carried things and lit fires. Not a person, not someone to speak with. Something was very, very wrong. "Of course, my lord," I said. He turned and left. I heard his footsteps climbing the stairs. Slower than usual, heavier. I washed my hands, went to the wine cellar, found the Dorwinian, a dark bottle with Sindarin script on the label that I couldn't read. Retrieved 2 glasses from the cabinet, even though he'd only mentioned one. If he wanted to talk, perhaps he'd want me to drink with him. Make it less formal, less like master and servant, more like, I don't know, humans having a conversation. I climbed the stairs to his study, found the door open, went in. The room was a disaster. I'd seen it messy before. Saruman wasn't particularly tidy when he was working, but this was different. This was chaos. Books scattered everywhere. Some lying open with their spines cracked, others thrown into corners like they'd been flung in anger or despair. Scrolls unrolled across every surface, their edges curling. Candles burned down to stubs, wax pooled on tables and dripping onto the floor. Papers covered in Saruman's handwriting, calculations, diagrams, text in multiple languages, scattered like leaves after a storm. And on his desk, covered with a black cloth, something round, about the size of a man's head, the palantír. He'd brought it down from the high chamber. That was unusual, dangerous even. The seeing stones were kept locked away when not in use. Too much risk of someone looking into them accidentally. Too much chance of Sauron, who controlled at least one of the stones, seeing through them and learning things he shouldn't. But there it sat, covered but present, like Saruman couldn't bear to be separated from it. He was sitting in his chair by the fireplace. The fire had burned low. I'd need to tend it soon. He was staring into the embers like they held answers. His hands gripped the armrests with white-knuckled intensity. I poured the wine, set one glass on the small table beside his chair, held the other uncertainly, not sure if I was meant to drink it or just have it ready. "Sit," Saruman said without looking at me. I sat in the other chair, the one that was usually reserved for important visitors, for Gandalf or members of the White Council, not for servants. Do you know what the hardest part of wisdom is, Taran? It was the first time he'd used my name. In 15 years of service, I'd never heard it pass his lips. I wasn't even entirely sure he knew it. "No, my lord," I said quietly. He finally looked at me, really looked at me, like he was seeing me as a person for the first time. "Seeing what's coming," he said, "knowing what will happen, understanding the shape of the future with such clarity that you can count the bodies before the war even begins. That's the curse of foresight, Taran. It shows you horrors that haven't happened yet. And then you have to live with that knowledge while everyone around you stays blissfully ignorant." He picked up his wine glass, took a long drink, almost drained it in one go. "I've spent 500 years studying," he continued, "learning, reading histories and prophecies and trying to understand the patterns, trying to prepare for what's coming. Do you know what I've learned?" I stayed silent, took a small sip of my own wine. It was excellent, rich and complex and completely wasted on me. "We're going to lose," Saruman said. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather or crop yields. "Sauron is going to win. The kingdoms are going to fall. Everything we've built over 3 ages, all the beauty, all the wisdom, all the noble struggle against the darkness, it's all going to burn." "But the White Council," I started. 5 wizards," Saruman cut me off. 5 wizards and a handful of elf lords against the combined might of Mordor, against armies that have been building for centuries in lands we can't reach, against a power that has existed since before the sun and moon were made, against a will that has spent thousands of years preparing for this moment. He laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. "Do you understand mathematics, Taran? Probability? The odds of 5 against hundreds of thousands. They're not in our favor. But we have the kingdoms, Gondor, Rohan, the elves of Lothlorien and Rivendell, the dwarves of Erebor. If we all stand together, then we'll fall together," Saruman said. "Unity doesn't change the fundamental equation. We're outnumbered, outpowered, out-prepared. Sauron has spent millennia planning this war. We've spent a few centuries reacting to it. That's not a strategy. That's desperation." He stood, started pacing. The movement was agitated, unlike his usual measured calm. "Gandalf thinks we can win through hope," he said. "Through inspiring men and elves to fight bravely. Through trusting that somehow, despite all evidence to the contrary, good will triumph simply because it's good. He's a fool. A well-meaning fool, but a fool nonetheless." "Then what do we do?" I asked. Saruman stopped pacing, looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I'd never seen before. Uncertainty. Real, genuine uncertainty. Like he was about to tell me something and didn't quite believe it himself. "I used the palantír tonight," he said quietly. "Not for scrying, not to spy on Sauron's armies or gather intelligence. I looked directly at him, at the Dark Tower, at Sauron himself. I wanted to see his face, to understand what we're truly up against. And," the word came out as barely a whisper, "he was waiting for me," Saruman said. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind picked up, and in that moment, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "He knew I would look eventually," Saruman continued. "Knew that someone would use a palantír to try to peer into Barad-dûr. He was prepared. He showed me things, visions, futures, possibilities, all the ways this war could end." "What did you see?" Saruman walked to the window. Orthancs's study looked out over Isengard, and beyond it, the rolling plains of Rohan, stretching toward the horizon. Peaceful lands, lands that had known prosperity for generations. "I saw Minas Tirith burning," he said softly. "The White City reduced to rubble. The Pelennor fields covered in corpses, men, elves, horses, all piled so high you couldn't see the grass beneath. I saw Edoras overrun, the Golden Hall aflame, the people of Rohan slaughtered or enslaved or fleeing west with nothing but what they could carry. I saw the Shire burning, every hobbit hole collapsed, every tree cut down. The green lands turned black with ash and blood. I saw Rivendell abandoned, Imladris silent and empty, the elves having fled or died. I saw Lothlorien withered, the golden trees turned grey and lifeless, Galadriel's mirror shattered, the forest dark and haunted by things that had once been beautiful. I saw Erebor besieged, the dwarves starving behind their locked doors, too proud to surrender, too weak to break out, just waiting to die. I saw all of it, Taran. Every kingdom, every stronghold, every last place where free people live. And in every vision, The outcome was the same. They fell. All of them. One by one or all together. It didn't matter. They fell. He turned to face me. His expression was haunted. And at the end, after everything burned and everyone died, Sauron stood alone in a world of ash, victor of a war that had left nothing worth conquering, ruling over ruins because there was nothing else left to rule. But those are just possible futures, I said desperately. Not certainties. I saw 1,000 futures, Saruman interrupted. The palantír shows probabilities, paths, likely outcomes based on current trajectories. And I am very, very good at reading them. I've studied scrying and foresight for centuries. I understand how to interpret what the stones show. And I'm telling you, every path where we fight him directly, where we oppose his armies with valor and hope and united purpose, they all end in fire. He sat back down, poured himself more wine. So I asked the stone to show me something else, he said. I asked it to show me paths where we don't fight, where we choose differently, where we adapt to the new reality instead of breaking ourselves against it. Surrender, I said. Survival, Saruman corrected. There's a difference. Surrender means giving up. Survival means making choices, hard choices, that keep people alive. What kind of choices? Saruman was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to his desk, and pulled the black cloth off the palantír. The seeing stone gleamed in the firelight. It was beautiful, perfectly spherical, made of some dark crystal that seemed to have depth to it. Looking at it was like looking into deep water. You could see layers, dimensions, things moving in the depths that might have been reflections or might have been something else entirely. He spoke to me, Saruman said, his voice barely above a whisper. Through the stone. Sauron himself. He spoke directly into my mind. I felt my blood go cold. The palantíri were made for communication, Saruman continued. That's their original purpose, to allow the rulers of Númenor to speak with each other across vast distances. Sauron controls at least one of the stones, the one from Minas Ithil that was taken when the city fell. Through that stone, he can reach out to the others, speak through them. And he spoke to me. What did he say? Saruman touched the surface of the palantír lightly. His fingers trembled. He said he respects wisdom, Saruman said quietly, that he has no quarrel with those who seek knowledge and understanding, that his war isn't with scholars and thinkers, it's with the proud, the foolish, those who oppose him not from reason, but from blind adherence to old prejudices and ancient grudges that no longer serve any purpose. He's lying, I said. He's the Dark Lord, the enemy. Everything he says is it? Saruman looked at me. What if we're wrong about him? Or at least, what if the story is more complicated than we've been told? He was Myron once, one of the Maiar of Aule, a spirit of order and craft. He wanted to organize Middle-earth, make it efficient, perfect. Yes, Morgoth corrupted him. Yes, his methods became harsh, but his fundamental goal, bringing order to chaos, stopping the endless cycles of war and suffering, what if that goal was never evil? What if it was just practical? Practical? I repeated numbly. Saruman started pacing again. His words came faster now, like a dam breaking. He showed me a different vision, he said. A different future. One where I don't stand against him. Where I acknowledge reality. Accept that he's going to win and position myself to minimize the damage when he does. By helping him, I said. By not hindering him, Saruman said. There's a difference. He doesn't need my help. He's going to win regardless, but he offered me a place in the new order. Not as a slave, not as a servant, as an ally, a partner in the reconstruction. He would give me Isengard, protection for my people, resources to continue my research, freedom to pursue knowledge without interference, and in return, I would use my wisdom to help him establish his new order, efficiently, with minimal bloodshed, making sure that when the war ends, and it will end with his victory, there's still something left to rebuild. That's not a different future, I said. That's the same future, just with you on his side instead of ours. There is no ours and his in this calculation, Saruman snapped. There's only mathematics, only probability, only the cold, hard reality that we cannot win this war. Every strategic analysis I've done reaches the same conclusion. Every projection, every simulation, we lose. The only variable is how many people die before we do. He sat down again, leaned forward. His voice became quieter, more intense. Listen to me, Taran. I've advised kings for centuries. I've watched nations rise and fall. I've seen wars that seemed righteous and necessary end in nothing but misery for everyone involved. And I can tell you something that most people won't admit. People don't actually want freedom. Not really. They want safety. They want to know their children won't starve, that raiders won't burn their farms, that there will be a tomorrow that looks roughly like today. Freedom is abstract. It's a concept. It sounds good in songs and speeches. But when darkness comes, when armies march and cities burn and real death threatens, people choose survival. They always choose survival, and they'll accept whatever system promises it to them. Sauron's offering that. A system, harsh, yes, controlling, absolutely, but stable, predictable, safe. After a generation, maybe two, people won't even remember what they lost. They'll just live their lives, raise their families, plant their crops, under a system that works. That's not life, I said. That's a prison. And how is that different from what we have now? Saruman challenged. Tell me, Taran, in Rohan, are you free? Can you do anything you want? Go anywhere? Say anything? Or are you bound by laws and customs and obligations and the will of your king? We're all in prisons. The question is just which prison has better conditions. There's a difference between laws and slavery, I said. Is there? Laws compel behavior, punish disobedience, restrict choice. That's what power does. It constrains. The only difference between legitimate power and tyranny is whether you consent to it. And consent, given enough pressure, is flexible. He finished his wine, set the glass down with a sharp click. Sauron is going to win, he said. That's not opinion, that's fact. The mathematics are clear, and when he wins, there will be a choice for those of us who survive, resist pointlessly, and die, or adapt and live. And I'm choosing to live. Not for myself. I'm beyond such petty concerns. But for everyone I can protect. Everyone I can save from the slaughter that's coming. If I oppose him, thousands die. Maybe tens of thousands. And we still lose. If I work with him, those people live. Under his rule, yes. But alive. Growing old. Seeing their grandchildren. Isn't that worth something? Isn't life, even constrained life, better than noble death? No, I said. But my voice was uncertain. Saruman heard that uncertainty, seized on it. You see it too, he said. The logic, I know you do. Because you're not stupid, Taran. You've seen the world. You understand that purity is a luxury. That sometimes there are no good choices. Just less terrible ones. He stood again, walked to the palantír, placed his hand on it. "He's waiting for my answer," Saruman said quietly. "Right now, in Barad-dûr. He knows what I saw, knows I'll make the logical choice, the wise choice. He's patient, he can wait. But the longer I delay, the worse the terms become. He rewards those who come to him early, who see the truth before everyone else." "Don't," I said. "Please. Once you answer him, once you accept, I'll be alive," Saruman said. "And so will everyone I protect. That's all that matters. That's all that's ever mattered. The rest, pride, honor, noble struggles, they're stories we tell ourselves to make losing feel meaningful. But meaning doesn't feed children. It doesn't keep people warm. It doesn't stop armies." His hand closed around the palantír. His eyes went distant, unfocused, like he was looking at something very far away. "I see you," he whispered. "Yes, I understand. I accept your offer. I will not oppose you. I will guide the free peoples toward accommodation, toward understanding that resistance is futile, that the new age is coming whether they welcome it or not. And I will help make that transition as painless as possible." The room went cold. The fire dimmed. And in the depths of the seeing stone, I saw something move. Something vast. Something that noticed me looking, and I looked away, stared at the floor, my heart hammering. When I looked up again, Saruman had released the stone, was covering it with the black cloth. His hands were steady now. The shaking was gone. So was the fear. So was the uncertainty. He looked certain, resolved, like he'd made a decision and was now committed to it completely. "You'll tell no one about this conversation," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. "You'll continue your duties as normal. As far as anyone knows, I'm still working to oppose Sauron, still leading the White Council, still the wisest of the Istari." "But you're not," I said. "You're his. You sold yourself to—" "I sold nothing," Saruman said sharply. "I made a strategic alliance. I acknowledged reality. I chose wisdom over pride. There's a difference. I retain my independence, my research, my plans. I simply recognize that opposing Sauron is futile, that helping him establish order is more moral than fighting him and causing countless deaths for nothing." "That's a lie you're telling yourself," I said. "Perhaps," Saruman said. "Or perhaps it's the truth everyone else is too afraid to admit. We'll find out. In the meantime, you're dismissed." He walked to the door, paused. "Taran, if you speak of this to anyone at all, I'll know. And I'll have to ensure your silence more permanently. Not because I'm cruel, but because this knowledge is too dangerous, too likely to cause panic and resistance that would only make things worse when the inevitable arrives. Do you understand?" I nodded mutely. "Good. Clean up the study when you get a chance, and make sure the fire's attended tomorrow. I suspect I'll be spending time in my chambers, resting. This has been tiring." Then he left, climbed the stairs to his quarters, and I was alone with the covered palantír and a glass of expensive wine, and the knowledge that I'd just watched the greatest mind in Middle-earth choose darkness. I should have done something. Should have run to Gandalf. Should have sent word to the White Council. Should have smashed the seeing stone and damn the consequences. But I didn't. Because I was afraid. Because Saruman was right. He would know. And I was just a servant. Just a man with no power and no voice, and no ability to stand against a wizard who just allied himself with the Dark Lord of Mordor. So I cleaned up the study, put the books back on shelves, rolled up the scrolls, scraped the wax from the tables, tended the fire, covered the palantír more securely, and said nothing. That was 23 years ago. I'm an old man now, too old to serve in towers. I live in a small house on the outskirts of Edoras, far from Isengard, far from everything that happened there. And Saruman was wrong. About everything. The kingdoms didn't fall. Minas Tirith stood. Rohan rode to war. The Shire survived. Not unscathed, but alive. And Sauron, the Dark Lord, whose victory was mathematically certain, whose triumph was inevitable, whose power was overwhelming, he was destroyed by a hobbit, by the smallest, weakest, least important creature in all of Middle-earth, by someone Saruman would never have bet on, someone the mathematics wouldn't have predicted, someone who chose to walk into the fire anyway, even when hope was lost, even when wisdom said it was impossible. I think about that a lot, about how wrong Saruman was, about how his wisdom, all that knowledge, all that foresight, all those centuries of study, led him to choose evil because he couldn't imagine a world where good could actually win. He saw all the probable futures, calculated all the likely outcomes, made the logical choice based on perfect information, and he was completely, utterly wrong, because he forgot something that wisdom alone can never account for. He forgot about grace, about miracles, about the fact that sometimes, impossibly, against all odds and reason and probability, good wins not because it's strong, but because it's right. I saw Saruman one more time, years after the war, after Isengard had fallen and his power had broken, after he'd been cast out of the Order and stripped of his staff. He was wandering through Rohan, just an old man in filthy robes, begging for food. I gave him bread, water. He didn't recognize me at first. Then something in his eyes shifted, memory surfacing. "You," he said, "the servant, from Orthanc." "Yes, my lord." He flinched at the title. "I'm no one's lord anymore." We sat in silence for a while, him eating the bread like he hadn't had a proper meal in days, which he probably hadn't. "What happened?" I finally asked. "You had it all planned out. You made the logical choice. How did you get it so wrong?" He looked at me with eyes that were no longer wise, just tired, just old. "I forgot," he said quietly, "that people aren't mathematics, that the future isn't a problem to be solved with enough data, that sometimes the foolish choice is the right choice, that sometimes hope, stupid, irrational, impossible hope, is stronger than certainty." "You forgot that good can win," I said. "No." He shook his head. "I forgot that good is worth fighting for, even when it can't win. That's the difference between wisdom and whatever quality actually matters. I had all the wisdom in the world, every scrap of knowledge, every tool for calculating the odds, but I never understood the one thing that really counted." "What's that?" He was quiet for a long time, then stood to leave. "That some things matter more than winning," he said. "That choosing to do the right thing, even when it's futile, even when it's stupid, even when every rational calculation says it won't work. That choice itself has power, creates power, changes the equation in ways wisdom can't predict. And by the time I understood that," he trailed off. "By then it was too late. I'd already made my choice, already sold my wisdom for safety, and there was no going back." He walked away. I never saw him again. Heard later that he died somewhere in the Shire, killed by his own servant. A pathetic end for someone who'd once been the greatest of the Istari. I'm telling this story now because I'm old. Because the people who lived through the war are dying. Because soon there will be no one left who remembers that Saruman wasn't always evil. that he didn't fall because of pride or ambition or lust for power. He fell because he was wise, because he saw the future clearly, because he made the logical choice, the reasonable choice, the choice that would save the most lives and cause the least suffering. And that choice was wrong. That's what terrifies me. Not that evil exists, not that darkness can seduce the ambitious or the cruel, but that it can seduce the wise, that it can take someone who genuinely wants to help, who's trying to make the best possible decision, who's using all their knowledge and intelligence to solve an impossible problem, and lead them straight into darkness. Because Saruman was right about one thing: wisdom can see what's coming. It can calculate the odds. It can predict the probable outcomes with stunning accuracy, but it can't account for miracles, for grace, for the fact that sometimes, impossibly, good triumphs, not because it's strong, but because it's right. And if you can't see that possibility, if your wisdom is so complete that you've calculated away hope, then you've already lost. Not the war. Something more important. You've lost yourself. If you take anything from this story, take this. Don't trust wisdom alone. Don't let knowledge convince you that the impossible can't happen. Don't let foresight paralyze you into choosing darkness because the light seems too unlikely to bet on. Sometimes the smartest choice is the wrong choice. Sometimes you have to be foolish enough to hope. And sometimes, just sometimes, the fool proves the wise man wrong. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope you'll subscribe for more tales from Middle-earth, more witnesses to great events, more stories about the moments when people discovered that what they thought they knew was wrong. And remember, wisdom without hope is just despair with better vocabulary. Choose hope, even when it seems impossible, especially when it seems impossible.